本次研讨会下午场次，请各位尽速就座，谢谢。
Matalaw pagkuhay na panasaynun mita may unit tang hapumas saipuk yenjuming tulavian lincang i madasain tu palihansyap。
本次研讨会第2场专题演讲即将开始，我们请主持人原住民族委员会前任主委员林江义先生。
Matnataho isay jatu kiningkiwan hay nasya maisnasan it janata tu kaviat。Makasih。
那我们第2场次的专题演讲，我们就有请我们的前林前主委来为我们做主持。那现在把时间交给我们的林前主委。
在座各位学者、专家、各位贵宾、各位女士、先生，大家午安，大家好。那这个下午第1堂都是最辛苦。等一下呢，我们呢希望大家呢这个打起精神既然花了时间到这里来，我们希望有一点收获。那这个阶段这个场次呢，我们最主要的专题演讲的主题呢是针对活出我们的语言加拿大社区主导的语言复振的一个行动的一个介绍。那么我们也非常谢谢语言发展中心特别邀请了加拿大的第一民族的文化委员会的语言顾问，同时也是加拿大 BC 省的维多利亚大学的兼任助理的教授那 Dr. Susan Gessner 对 Dr. Susan Gessner 女士呢来担任今天的主讲。那么最主要呢，他在该哥伦比亚的大学呢，主要呢，他还是要介绍关于第一民族就是加拿大的第一民族在语言振兴方案的课程这一块他的经验还有方法策略。那另外呢，他最有兴趣的是针对社区为基础的第一民族语言的复振，跟他的语言政策，还有语言的权利，包括语言项目的评估等等。所以我想这是一个非常实务跟学术相结合的一场专题的演讲。我们现在呢，我们就请主讲的这个 Dr. Susan Gessner 来帮我们来主讲，我们热烈来鼓掌，好吗？来。
Okay, hello everyone. Hope you had a nice lunch. I want to start by acknowledging the territory of the Indigenous people here in Taiwan. That's the usual way we start presentations in Canada now, recognizing that this territory belongs to the Indigenous people. I want to thank our Bunun friends for the welcome this morning. And thank the CIP and the ILRDC, and especially Yeda, for the kind invitation to come and speak at this conference. This is my first time in Taiwan, so I've been very happy to be here and to learn about all the great work that's going on here in Taiwan. So thank you. I come from Canada, as you heard. I live in Vancouver. It's the traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish people. And so I can say Haitsepka, thank you, in their language for inviting me. There are 3 parts that I will discuss in my talk this afternoon. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on the Indigenous languages in Canada and who First Peoples Cultural Council is and what we do. I'll talk a little bit about our policy, advocacy, and research efforts. And finally, the programs and the support that we do, which are focused in two areas: fluency building programs, as well as collaboration, sharing, and documentation. To start off with, I don't know, who here has ever been to Canada before? Okay, so a few of you have, but most of you haven't. So I thought I'd start by showing you a little bit of a map. And Canada has 10 provinces, and then the 3 territories along the north, so 13 jurisdictions. I come from British Columbia, right on the west coast there. You see Victoria, the University of Victoria is partly who I'm representing. And our office for First Peoples is right near Victoria there. It's on reserve, it's traditional territory where our office is located. Now Canada has 60 Indigenous languages, and in British Columbia, I'm focusing mainly on British Columbia, we have 34 Indigenous languages just in that green part on the west coast there, 34 of the languages. So more than half of Canada's Indigenous languages are in BC. There's a great amount of diversity. These languages belong to 10 different language families, 7 different language families in BC. So by this I mean they're completely unrelated. So 7 completely unrelated to each other families. And in fact, 2 of those families are called language isolates, which means there's only one language in each of those families they're not related to any other language. So it's very interesting for me to see come to the Austronesian world where the languages are related over very great distances. 3 languages account for 2/3 of all mother tongue language speakers. And most languages do not have large numbers of speakers. So for example, 25 have fewer than 500 speakers. This is just a little map of the diversity of language families throughout North America. It's kind of hard to see all the colors in BC, but you can see in North America there's a great deal of diversity. So who is First Peoples Cultural Council? This is a Crown, so a government agency that's supported by both the Canadian federal government and the provincial government in funding. And in BC, we serve 203 different First Nations communities and the 34 languages that I mentioned before. Even though it's a provincial agency, it's very, very small. There's only about 9 employees who work at the agency, so it's not very big. First Peoples is governed by 34 positions representing each BC language. So we have Indigenous reps on our advisory committee and a board of directors, which is 3 First Nations reps and 3 government appointed seats. So the main work that we do are programs and support, so assisting communities to implement strategies to revitalize their languages. We do research and advocacy to try and report on and promote Indigenous languages, especially at the national level. And I want to emphasize that all of our programs are community driven. So it's Indigenous people in their own communities who are doing the programs, deciding what kind of programs they want to do and running the programs. And our role is to support them in that work. Most of you are probably familiar with this from the United Nations Declaration. So everyone has the right to use their own Indigenous languages. This is a really important thing, and we have a long way to go in Canada before the principles of the Declaration are met. So English and French are official languages of Canada. There is currently a bill in the Senate that's proposed to recognize Aboriginal languages. That's not to do not to give them official status, so it's not quite the bill that we want at this point, but it will, if it passes, recognize. The other problem, though, with a Senate bill is that it doesn't come with any financial responsibility, so it's not really the kind of bill we're hoping for. So we're working towards official status, but that's still a long way off, I think. There is some status at the provincial or territorial language or level. So when I mentioned those 3 territories across the top, the Inuit language has official status in the territory of Nunavut, so in the far north, and in the Northwest Territories as well. The Indigenous languages have status along with French and English. But federally there is not. So as I mentioned, part of what we do is to keep working with the provincial and federal government to try and gain more rights and more funding for Indigenous languages. And we submit different policy papers and so on to government on the status. We heard about the importance of traffic signage, having signs in the Indigenous languages. That's one thing that we're currently working on with the provincial government. And in terms of public education and awareness, we have had a partnership with a major museum in British Columbia to showcase the 34 languages of BC, which has really done a lot to increase awareness and increase status of the languages. And other than that, research and document. So as far as documenting the status, I'll tell you a little bit about the situation of languages in BC. The first time we did this was in 2010, and we did another report in 2014. And this is really the first time we had any idea what the numbers of speakers were for BC languages. I mean, we have census figures, but census figures tend to be quite inaccurate for Indigenous languages for a number of reasons. In part, it's because of the diversity of names for the languages and how they get categorized in the census and so on, and other issues. But so this was really the first time where we figured out, at least for British Columbia, how many speakers do we have. The data comes from the communities themselves, so they fill out an assessment for us so that we're hearing from the communities themselves how many speakers and fluent speakers. We had pretty good coverage, 91% of communities in BC reporting in this. I'll kind of go through this quickly because I don't think it's all that interesting to you, but I just want to give you a little sense of what it's like in BC. So fluent speakers, only 4% of Indigenous people in British Columbia can speak their language. So pretty low percentage. There's about 9% who would be classified as semi-speakers. And then we also included a category of learners as separate from those categories. So anyone who's learning. So maybe even fluent people are learning, semi-fluent, non-fluent, whoever's actively learning the language would be that figure. So as you can see from the 2 reports, the numbers of fluent speakers are decreasing. And this was not at all a surprise to us as the speakers are aging. And as you heard with our colleague Professor Zuckerman this morning, the reasons are very similar in Canada. There was a residential school system that removed children from their homes, often as young as age 2 until age 16 or 18. The system was in operation for over 100 years, and the last school closed in 1996. So it's not even really a thing of the past. There are many people who were still going to residential schools just 20 years ago. Of course, one of the main aims at the schools was to ensure that the languages were lost and people were forbidden from speaking their language and punished in often severe ways for speaking their language. So you can see from the ages of speakers that the majority of fluent speakers are older than 65 years of age, and only 1% of the fluent speakers are in the 0 to 24 age group. So that doesn't sound too promising so far, but we look to this for our positive hope, which is the number of semi-speakers increased quite a bit from 2010 to 2014. So people who wouldn't have considered themselves a speaker at all 4 years earlier are now counted as semi-speakers. So what that means is there are a lot of people who are now learning as a second language. So we do see the numbers of semi-speakers going up. I won't spend a lot of time here, but there are some language programs in schools, but like many of you have mentioned in your talks this morning, it's not very much. On average, even in First Nations operated schools on reserve, it's only about 5.7 hours a week, so an hour a day of language. And that's at best. Many schools do not even have language offered, so there's a long way to go in terms of education and also in resources. But just to summarize that's just to give you a little picture of where we're at in BC. There's much more work to be done. So now I'll tell you about the kind of work that is being done. And starting with our fluency building programs. There's 4 main ones that I'll talk about. So the Language Nest program, the Mentor Apprentice program, language houses, and our silent speaker course. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Language Nest program, which developed in New Zealand and then was taken up in Hawaii and has been a very successful initiative. So language immersion for the preschool age group. Currently we have 12 nests as of this fall. There will be 12 nests that are supported by our organization in BC. There's a lot of successes, as you know, with nests. So it can develop language ability for young learners. It can get that young parent generation motivated to learn. And it's often a stepping stone to the development of immersion schools or language programming in schools. However, we find that it's very, very difficult to maintain 100% immersion in the nest context, which is the goal of the nest. Teachers might lack fluency in the language, or you might have fluent teachers who lack the early childhood education, and sometimes due to certification, that's a problem as well. And probably the biggest problem is that there's no follow-up for these children. All of the children who go through the nest, some of them do develop quite a lot of fluency in those young years, but then it stops when they go to school. Because out of our 203 First Nations communities, we only have 3 immersion schools right now that offer any significant amount of language. One program that has been quite successful for us is the Master Apprentice program. It's been renamed the Mentor Apprentice program in BC. Many of you are probably familiar with this one as well, which developed in California with Native Americans. It's a one-on-one language immersion. So if you think about the problem with our nests, one of the problems is we don't have enough fluent speakers to work in the language nests. The fluent speakers are mostly over 65 years of age, and you don't want to ask all of your elders to spend their time running after preschoolers and changing diapers and everything that you do with preschoolers, right? So Master Apprentice is one way to get that younger generation more fluent, so then they can be the ones who become the language teachers and working in the nests and so on. So they're expected to do 10 to 12 hours a week, 300 hours per year of funding, and they can get up to 3 years of funding. There's some of our teams along the bottom there. Sometimes it's Sometimes they're related. We have a lot of grandchild teams that have gone through the programs, but sometimes they're not at all related. It's just a fluent speaker in the community who's paired with a learner, and they do activities together, everyday activities in the language in order to learn the language. When we started this program in 2008, we had support from the developers of the program, Leanne Hinton and the advocates in California. We've had 90 apprentices participate in the program, covering 28 of our 34 languages. We've also modified the program a bit to include an evaluation component, and we've been working on some research to evaluate the program in the last couple of years. Although it can be very successful, it's a very challenging way to learn a language. So first of all, the apprentice really needs a lot of commitment. When you think 10 to 15 or ideally 10 to 20 hours a week to learn your language, that's a lot of time. And these learners are often young parents, they might work full-time, they have a lot of other life commitments, so it can be pretty challenging. Learning all by yourself can be also very challenging, as you can imagine. And simply a shortage of mentors is another problem that we face in many communities. We also don't have a lot of funding for the program, so I think we had 65 new applications this year, and we could fund 18 of them. So, you know, there's much more demand than available funds. On the other hand, it's really been a good way to get people to a functional level of fluency in their language when there's very often no other way to do so. It's really built intergenerational relationships between elders and younger people. Because remember, with that whole residential school experience where people were taken away from their communities, those intergenerational bonds really weren't there anymore in the way they were traditionally. We've seen a lot of healing, we've seen a lot of ripple effects. So usually even having one apprentice in the community sort of creates more interest in other language learners. Many of our apprentices either started out as teachers or became teachers or preschool educators, so everything that they do goes back to the kids. Many are young parents and are now speaking to their children in their homes. So there is an influence on children in the community. And hopefully some long-term benefits as well. Yeah, just some things that we hope for the future. And there's another one of our teams there. And I know that apprentice there, she tells the story of how she was inspired to learn her language by going to New Zealand. And a Maori woman asked if she spoke her language, and she said no. And she said, "Where will you be without your language?" And so that's what got her involved. So just to share with you a few thoughts from some of our apprentices. So learning our language, I feel like I've found myself. I was missing a big part of my identity, and now that I'm beginning to understand my father's language, it's like I feel like I'm coming home inside of myself with each new word. It's really something I treasure. And the second one, this is my soul that I'm learning right now. And yeah, we're all fighting for our language. So we spoke a little bit this morning about the relationship between identity and language, and we can certainly see that in our learners in this program. A relatively new concept that's been developing in BC now is called a language house. And it's another method of adult language immersion, and it's basically like the master-apprentice model, where you have a fluent elder and a learner, but typically you have many more learners who come together in the house, And either they live together or they spend all day together in the house and then they go home in the evenings. But it's generally a group of learners and sometimes rotating elders through the house. So you're creating your own immersion. And in fact, even in the city, there's a few young people who have developed a degree of fluency and have just taken this idea up on their own, rented an apartment and said, okay, if you want to come live in the apartment, it's Squamish language only in this apartment. So people are creating their own spaces for language, and I think it's a really exciting development. And yeah, you learn everyday language in all situations. The last one I want to talk to you about in terms of fluency development is also very new and something we're very excited about. And it's a silent speaker course. So I don't know if you've heard the term silent speaker, or some of you may know the term receptive bilinguals. Basically, a silent speaker is someone who understands the language but can't speak the language. So you might know people like this. In Canada, it's often because of people who spoke the language until they went to residential schools, so they had they were fluent as children, but then haven't used the language since they were children. But they have that memory, they have a lot of language knowledge. It might be people who simply grew up around grandparents or aunties and uncles speaking the language, but the language was never spoken to them, and they never spoke the language. So they, again, have this receptive knowledge. They understand, but they don't speak. And we literally have thousands of silent speakers in BC. So a few years ago, we had the opportunity to have a visitor who was Sami from Sweden, so the Indigenous Sami people. And she told us about the course that they had been doing there for the last 15 years or so. And it uses cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is a type of psychological therapy to help silent speakers. Now, it's not a theory or a therapy that deals with trauma, so it's not to deal with, the deep issues of residential school abuse and so on. It's really a short-term therapy that's meant to help people change the way they think about certain behaviors. So think is the cognitive part and behavioral for the other part. So for example, it's used to help people quit smoking or lose weight, those kinds of things. But they used it to apply to language. So to just give you a little bit of an example of how it would work, you would, in the sessions with the silent speakers, you would talk about why you don't speak your language. And a silent speaker might say, well, because everybody laughs at me when I speak my language. And the therapist would say, okay, let's make a list. Who laughed at you when you spoke your language? And when they think about it, they realize, well, actually, I never tried, and I don't know if anyone is going to laugh at me. Right? So it's just little things like that to try and help people see that, okay, make some steps forward here and try to speak my language in a safe context. So we piloted the course in January with one of our communities. We had 10 participants, and the class was 2 hours a week for 10 weeks. We had our CBT, our therapy lesson. We had a language lesson, and there was a lot of sharing as part of this experience. There was a homework component where every week I would give the students an assignment where they would go practice with a fluent mentor, so a little language practice, go and see if you can introduce yourself. Work with your mentor to introduce yourself, something small that they could work on every week. There was also an internship component where they had the opportunity to volunteer in a language setting in the community. This community had an active language nest, so participants could go and try and use language in the immersion nest or in the high school language class. And the results of the course, it came out quite strongly that all participants use the language more after the course. And remember, these are silent speakers. These are 10 people who were not using their language at all before the course started. So now all of them are using the language at least some of the time, and some of them are actually committed to really getting involved much more in terms of going to volunteer at the nest or starting other language programs in the community. So for us, this is a very exciting new development, because I think everyone here knows how hard it is to learn a language as an adult. But if you have people who already have that base knowledge, and if you can just help them move forward to speak a little bit more, we could create many more speakers much more quickly. It's interesting, my colleague here, Professor Zuckerman, was talking this morning about some of the same research that I have on my slides as well, because we've been very interested, especially as part of this program, in the link between language and wellness. And there's more and more studies that show exactly that, and talking about all those economic benefits and so on. If you can reduce many health problems, that will certainly be an economic benefit as well. There's 2 new studies that link knowing your language to reduced rates of diabetes, in fact, in Canada. And you might think, diabetes, how does that? That's a strange connection, right? The authors suggest it may be that people who are involved in their language and culture are maybe also more likely to eat traditional foods, which are much more healthy than the standard Western diet that most people are eating. So that might be a reason. But in any case, peer-reviewed studies that showed this link between language and reduced diabetes. Mental health, with the suicide study referred to earlier. Resilience to HIV, linked to language and culture knowledge as well. And of course, we all know that there's many benefits in being bilingual, not just for children, but for adults as well. There's a few recent studies that, for example, have shown bilingual adults getting Alzheimer's is delayed by about 5 years if you're bilingual, as opposed to if you're not. And aside from that, all the indirect benefits, like the educational outcomes, we have lots of good evidence, not from our province, but in other parts of Canada, where immersion schools have been implemented all through to grade 12. Those students are graduating at a much higher rate, in the high 87%, I think, of students graduate from high school, when the average for Indigenous students in Canada is less than 50% graduating from high school. So you see lots of benefits like that as well. So those were all the fluency programs that we've been working on. So now I want to talk just a little bit about some of the language program support that we do. So the other thing we do is research and develop resources for communities. So just little handbooks that communities can take and use in their work. And Yetta will be talking about the one that's been translated to Mandarin now, which we're very excited about. We also offer training workshops. So this is not simply a funding organization where you get a grant and away you go. Everyone who's funded has training workshops and ongoing support, especially the Our Apprentice program. We're supporting them all through the program. We're calling them every month and helping them as they do their work. We also have a number of programs that involve documentation or collaboration and sharing. The Language Revitalization Planning Program. There are some of our communities there. As I mentioned, we have 34 languages, but well over 60 dialects. I think the largest one language having about 13 different dialects. And it often seems that each community tries to reinvent the wheel when they start doing their own work. So we have this program to try and provide some support for communities to come together and share what they've been doing, which will hopefully save time and money and resources for everyone and help them to do strategic planning. We also have First Voices, which is a web-based tool. It's like an online dictionary with recordings for a number of languages, not just in BC. And many of them have apps as well. And we have also now the keyboards apps, so you can type in the special characters that many of the Indigenous languages require. We have an online language map that people can check out and click on each language to see information on their language in terms of resources and numbers of speakers and so on. And another project that's called the Endangered Languages Project. Our organization, we've stopped using the term endangered language ourselves, or we try to. We like to look at things in a more positive light, and as you know, even languages with no speakers can be revived, right? So we try to tone down this language about dying and endangered, right? We like to see our languages as living. However, we are part of this Endangered Languages Project, and I especially want to draw your attention to it because it's for all languages. So it's a website that all of you can use to go on if you want to have a place to share information on your languages. So it's kind of a Wikipedia idea. So you can look up your language, you can get a login, and you can upload videos, you can upload resources, you can do whatever you want for your language. It's a partnership with Google, and I guess I missed having our other partners on there, but the University of Michigan, where the Linguist List is based, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa are partners on this, along with Google. So that's the website if you're interested. So that's a quick look at what we're doing in British Columbia and our work with First Peoples Cultural Council. Again, I want to emphasize it is the communities who are really taking the initiative in all of this work. We really feel that there are reasons for optimism and hope. As I mentioned, we really talk about living our languages, which is the title of this talk. And we think that there's many positive things, such as this conference, where we have the opportunity to share with and learn from all of the good work that's going on in Taiwan and in Australia and New Zealand and all over. So I think it's a very exciting time for Indigenous languages. There's all of our information. Our main website is just fpcc.ca, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions about this, if you don't get a chance to talk to me later. And all of the resources that I've talked about in the presentation are available for free on our website. So, I mean, they are in English, but if you want to use them, you can download them, you can modify them, you can change them, you can use them. So if there's anything there that might help you in your work, you're welcome to do that. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
我们首先非常谢谢今天的主讲啊。那我们刚刚啊听了非常精彩的这个报告，大致上我听了，大概分成4个很重要的重点。第一个重点呢，主讲的特别为我们介绍了加拿大 BC 省，就是哥伦比亚省，这它里面的这个省里面的各第一民族它的语言的现况。第 第二个部分，他特别介绍他们现在推动的在语言的这个策略上面，他们做了哪些的努力。第三个呢，他特别也介绍，其实推动这个语言有附带很多的收益包括健康的。最后呢，他提出他现在呢，他们自己在网站上面的一些资源，可以让大家来行收。那我想他提供了这4个非常重要的资讯给大家。我想后面呢还有一点时间，不晓得各位有什么提问没有？好，对 ，Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question about purism or prescriptivism. Is it the case that sometimes there are elders who say you do not speak the language properly, you should speak the language better? In other words, give us authenticity or give us death? And if it is the case, then whether it is a problem that sometimes results in death?
That is a very common problem in British Columbia. As you saw, most of our speakers are elders. They're over the age of 65. And they do believe, many of them believe that, if you're going to speak it, you have to speak it right. And it can be very discouraging for the young learners because, as second language learners, we make a lot of mistakes when we're starting out. So it can be very discouraging. We haven't completely lost any languages yet due to just that reason, but it's an ongoing problem. What I will say is it takes a core group of young people getting involved. When you get a core group of young learners, so more than just 1 or 2 or 3 in a community, when you get sort of a movement of learners, then that seems to turn around. And the elders start to see that there is progress being made, and you just have larger numbers too. But definitely it's a huge issue, and it's part of the issue with our silent speakers and what we deal with in the course as well, because they're scared to speak because the elders criticize them. Now part of it is just education for the elders too, just a little explanation about what it is as an adult to learn a language, and it's like being a baby even though you're an adult, right? So that we have to expect some mistakes. But there is a real fear of losing the authentic language, the real language, and especially all those glottal sounds and all the all the special sounds that we have in the languages. So
我们还有没有其他的问题？好吧？特别我们几位推动我们原住民族语言的政策的各位的经验上面，其实可以交换有还没有其他的宝贵的意见？好，来。
I should speak English, but my English is not as well. 我用国语问好，可以吗？我很想了解一下，说像他们在加拿大因为我们这边台湾这边。那个老师，那个族语的老师，他们到学校教，好像他们都很在意说，他们是怎么去付他们的薪水。那所以这个是很实际的问题。那他们都认为说，哎呀，到学校交都这么一点点的钱没有办法过日子啦。那所以他们就学校要找老师很难找到老师啊。那年轻人也没有年轻的老师比较没有这个语言的能力啊，老的他没有那个罗马拼音的那个能力，所以两者要找老师很困难，而且那个薪资很少。所以我想请问加拿大对于老师在学校教母语，他们是怎么样子照顾
？Yes, we have exactly the same problems in British Columbia. many of the language teachers, as you point out, are not paid as much as regular teachers because many of the fluent speakers have been given certification to teach, special certification, but they don't have their full teacher certification, so they're not paid the same as any other teachers. Even teachers who are certified feel that they have an unfair situation because there's no curriculum. We have only one of 34 languages has a full textbook series. None of the others have even a textbooks that you can use. So the teachers must create all the curriculum they use. So those same problems exist. I'll tell you about a relatively new program at the University of Victoria where I work. There's an Indigenous language revitalization program and also a master's in Indigenous language revitalization now. The first graduates finished just 1 year ago, I guess. So it's only been about five, 6 years that the program's been in operation. But the program takes a cohort of students from one community. So let's say they started with 10 to 20 students from a community who wanted to be language teachers. And the program keeps the students in their community, so they don't come to the city to study with us. We, the instructors, go to the community and we teach in a concentrated way. So maybe for 2 whole days, 4 times during the term or something like that. And it allows the students to stay in the community, learn the language from the elders, and develop their teaching certification at the same time. So like I said, it's quite new. There's just been 1 graduation of fully certified students from 2 communities, but it seems to be quite a successful way of creating a number of teachers because they stay in their community. They can support each other because they're all learning at the same time. And so I can refer you to the website of that program if that helps. But I think, keeping people in communities is key because at least in BC, that's where the languages are still spoken, right? You come to the city and there might be speakers of the language, but finding them is another thing. So keeping people in their communities to become teachers in their communities, I think, is the key.
好，我们最后还有一个问题哈，我们请后面看。
我原则上有2个问题哦。第一个问题就是，我相信从过去口述传承的过程里面会出现标准化的问题。那这个标准化的问题有没有造成老人家使用的一般日常生活使用的语言跟学校教的语言有落差？那因为在过去的例子，像在法国的科西嘉岛，因为一开始他要复振他的语言的时候，经过标准化的语言，反而没有人要学，因为太困难。那后来调整之后呢，开始慢慢有人去学习科西嘉语。所以因为这样的问题，其实在台湾也有碰到这样的一个问题，比如说阿美语经过标准化之后呢，其实跟部落里面说话的方式有一点落差。好，那这个就会被讨论。那另外一个提到的是说，方言别这个问题，阿美族也有碰到这样的一个问题，就是不同的方言别彼此之间呢，会讨论到说，某个方言群的老师不能到另外一个方言别的地方教学，因为他教的会不一样。大家开始去争执这个界限的问题，这个边界的问题，这个边界本来是看不见的，现在变成越来越清楚。那在加拿大是不是也有这样的问题？谢谢。
Yes, and we have the same problem as well in British Columbia. There's a lot of diversity of dialects, and there tends to be a lot of argument over which one should be taught. And everyone wants their own dialect to be taught, of course. So, that's a big problem why we don't have curriculum for most of the languages. There's never been an agreement on standardization for many of the languages. So sometimes there's some materials in one dialect and some in another. yeah, I don't have a solution to your question because yes, it's definitely a problem. I know I've heard elders get up and say, it doesn't matter. My grandparents, not only did they not speak all the different dialects, but they spoke all of the neighboring languages too, right? And so people will say, stop fighting about dialects, it's wasting time. But unfortunately, yes, there's a lot of fighting about dialects where I come from too. So.
吉瓦斯老师好吗？
I have a question for Suzanne.
Yeah.
Okay. You talk about programs in Canada are community driven. Actually, in Taiwan, most of our programs are government driven. So programs are supported by the government's fundings 100%. Only few of them are community driven. So I am wondering, how are you going to do that by community driven? What do you mean about community driven?
Well, there is some government funding, but it's very little funding. So people are doing programs with or without funding, basically. And what we mostly mean by community-driven is our agency, although we're government-funded, we don't mandate any sort of program in any community. It's up to the communities to decide, I want to have a language nest, and then they apply to us and say, we're going to do a language nest, and then we help them do the language nest. But we don't, by community driven, I simply mean that all of the initiative comes from the communities to do it. And actually we would like to see more government support. We would like to see it more the other way around as well. I mean, you want the community driven initiative, but we need much more financial support to do all that communities would like to do. So yeah, by community driven I mean, yeah, we don't, there's no, yeah, the government doesn't mandate anything when it comes to language. And in fact, they almost passed an education bill 2 years ago that mandated English or French only in all First Nation schools. And well, it didn't get passed. But yeah, the government is not really on the same page. So.
好，我们这一个场次，因为时间的关系呢，我们就要到这里告一个段落。其实我在这里要很诚恳跟各位在座的各位专家学者这最后的我当主任委员最后的这2年，我先后带了我们的乡镇长到纽西兰，到夏威夷，也跟我们的同仁到加拿大。我要很诚恳跟各位在座长期推动原住民族语言这10几年来，台湾的原住民的语言的维护跟发展，其实在世界上是很领先的，真的非常的领先。我这很诚恳跟各位，虽然我们在当主委的时候一再说各位做的不太好，这样事实上各位做的非常好。我们到加拿大的时候，加拿大的在纽西兰的推动他们的语言的发展协会的理事长亲自做简报，在我们在国内以为纽西兰的以为做得比我们好很多，其实他很诚恳说，在纽西兰我们的语言呢，他说他们的语言的使用率，当然不是他们的我们看见的4%了，他们是63%。我想教文处最近调查的，我们每一组的语言的能力有维持在60%，其实我们跟他们是不相上下的。我们刚刚也听了，看加拿大推动的，它的包括师徒制的，包括学前教育的， 幼儿保姆的师资，跟我们这个其他的推动的，就是我们台湾的原住民也做得很好，已经做得很不错。其实真正我们要克服的是，目前25万在都市的原住民，他的语言怎么样去处理？假如我们能找得到一个方法处理这一块，我想我们台湾原住民的语言应该有办法做得非常的好。我是这样子来看。拿破仑说过一句话这个说得好是聪明人，计划的好更聪明，但是呢，做得好才是最聪明。我想举办这样的一个研讨会，希望呢是寄望大家从计划把它做得更好。我想学习很多别的国家的经验，这是最好的一个机会。我想我们这一堂呢，我们就到此结束。非常谢谢大家。